Warping a PS seismic image to align reflectors with those in a PP seismic image can cause wavelet distortion. Now usually, to reduce this wavelet distortion, a shaping filter is applied after warping. Last year, we proposed a method to reduce this wavelet distortion by applying a filter before and after warping, but with this method we were able to estimate the PP and PS wavelets. This year, we're proposing a new method to estimate these wavelets. First, I want to call your attention to two continuous signals, P of t and Q of t. Now I want to note that all symbols in red from now on will be related to the PS trace or the PS wavelet, and all symbols in blue will be related to the PP trace or the PP wavelet. Now if I were to convolve these signals with the wavelets shown here, I would get a simple, let's say a simple PP trace and a simple PS trace as shown, where the PP trace is F of t and the PS trace is G of t. Now if I were to squeeze the PS trace to the PP trace, I would get wavelet distortion. So how can I reduce this wavelet distortion? Well, in this simple case, where the amount of squeezing applied to the PS trace is time invariant, I can use a simple shaping filter. But in more complicated or realistic cases, where the amount of squeezing applied to the PS tracer image is time variant, we'll need a different method to reduce this wavelet distortion. Now, to figure out what this method is, let's look at P of t and Q of t again. If I were to squeeze Q of t to P of t, I would get no wavelet distortion. Now in this case, I've multiplied the squeeze Q of t by a factor of 2. And the reason for doing this, as shown above, is that when I multiply a delta, or when I squeeze a delta function by some factor, I have to multiply it by the corresponding factor I squeezed by to make it equal to the original delta function, which would yield no wavelet distortion. Now, before I get into the meat of things, I want to review a simple concept that I know you all know, which is convolution. Now let's say I were to convolve a sampled sequence B with a sampled sequence G. And let's say B has 3 coefficients and G has 5 coefficients. Then we could write this convolution as the matrix B times the vector G, where the matrix B contains time-delayed versions of the vector B. We could also write this convolution as the matrix G times the vector B, where the matrix G contains time-delayed versions of the vector G. Now because convolution is commutative, we can write this as, these two equations are equal. So the matrix B times the vector G is equal to the matrix G times the vector B. Now I bring this up because I'm going to be using this property quite frequently in the rest of the presentation. So now, what is warping with wavelets? To answer this question, let's say we want to squeeze the simple PS trace G to the simple PP trace F. Well, warping with wavelets would require us to convolve the PS trace G with the inverse PS wavelet B, reducing it to a set of impulses. Our next step would be then to squeeze this deconvolved trace to the PP trace F. Now this squeezing operator is represented by the matrix S, and this matrix S will be colored in black because it's simply the transfer operator between PS time and PP time. Our final step in warping with wavelets is to convolve this squeezed deconvolved trace with the PP wavelet C, yielding no wavelet distortion. Now I want to point out that the wavelets, or the PP wavelet C and the inverse PS wavelet B, do not commute with the matrix S. And this is important to us because we can now solve for our wavelets individually. But how do we estimate these wavelets? Well, to answer this question, let's look at the warping with wavelets equation. And this warping with wavelets equation is simply the PP trace is approximately equal to the PS trace convolved with the inverse PS wavelet B, which has then been squeezed and then convolved with a PP wavelet C. Now I can rewrite this equation in two ways for us to estimate the PP wavelet C and the inverse PS wavelet B. First, let me estimate the inverse PS wavelet B. And to do this, I can rewrite this equation the following way. In the following way. Because convolution is commutative, I can switch B and G as shown. And then I can compute what we call the matrix P, which is simply CSG, and which reduces the equation to the following. Now what is this matrix P? Well, in the simple case that the inverse PS wavelet B contains 3 coefficients, the matrix P would contain 3 columns. And these 3 columns would simply be time-delayed versions of the PS trace that have been squeezed and convolved with the PP wavelet C. Now I want to point out that the matrix P depends on the PP wavelet C. So how do we compute this PP wavelet C? Well, to answer this question, let's go back to the warping with wavelets equation. We can compute what we call the vector Q, which is simply the PS trace convolved with the inverse PS wavelet that has been squeezed. And then we reduce the equation to the following. Now because convolution is commutative, we can switch C and Q as shown. Now what is this matrix Q? Well, in the simple case that the PP wavelet C has 3 coefficients, the matrix Q would have 3 columns. And these 3 columns would simply be time-delayed versions of the vector Q, which would mean that the matrix Q is the Toeplitz matrix. Now I want to point out that the matrix Q depends on the inverse PS wavelet B. So last year, we used these 2 equations in a cyclic search to estimate the PP wavelet and the inverse PS wavelet. But this year, we're going to use the Gauss-Newton method to estimate these wavelets. Now the overall objective function that we want to minimize in this case is simply the 2 norm squared of this residual vector R. Now this residual vector contains 2 types of residuals. One type of residual is this data residual, RD, which is simply the difference between the warped PS trace, or CSVG, and the PP trace F. Now, the other type of residual that we have here is the penalization residual, RP. Now, I won't go into the mathematical details of RP, but the main purpose of this penalization residual is simply to penalize the larger lags in the inverse PS wavelet B. Why would we want to do this? Well, let's say we estimate the inverse PS wavelet B. And let's say with this estimation, we just happen to get the true inverse PS wavelet. Well, if we add one more coefficient to this wavelet B and then re-estimate the inverse PS wavelet, this new coefficient would be 0 because we have already obtained the true wavelet. And this is what we're trying to replicate by driving or penalizing those larger lags and driving them towards 0. There's this other term I have here, which is alpha, and this simply controls the degree at which we penalize the larger lags in the inverse PS wavelet B. But before I get into alpha, let's talk about the data residual. Now let's say we have an estimate of the PP wavelet C and the inverse PS wavelet B. Then our corresponding data residual would be the following for a simple synthetic case. Now if I multiplied the inverse PS wavelet by 10 and the PP wavelet by 1/10, then we would get the same data residual, as shown. So how do we eliminate the scale factor ambiguity? Well, we eliminate it by setting the coefficient that corresponds to 0 seconds in the inverse PS wavelet B, we'll call it B0, we set this coefficient equal to 1. We make it so that it remains 1 throughout the entire iterative process. So now let's jump back to this alpha term, or at the degree at which we penalize these larger lags in B. And to show you how we choose alpha, I'm simply going to show you the RMS of all of our residuals with iteration for a simple Gauss-Newton case. So first we're going to set alpha equal to 0, and we're going to let the iterative process iterate until we reach a convergence threshold. I'm going to highlight these iterations with a green box. Now once we reach this convergence threshold, it's as if we've hit a local minimum. So to try and get out of this local minimum, we're going to set alpha to some non-zero positive value. So what we're going to see in our residuals is a spike, and then we're going to let the Gauss-Newton method iterate until we reach our next convergent threshold. I'm going to highlight these iterations with a blue box. Once we reach our next convergent threshold, we're going to set alpha back equal to 0 to drop the residuals down further. And then we'll be finished with our iterative process. I'm going to highlight these last few iterations with a green box. So now let's use this Gauss-Newton method to estimate our PP and PS wavelets for this simple synthetic case. Here the PP wavelet, or PP trace is F, and the PS wavelet is G. And notice how there are different wavelets in each trace. I want to point out that the variation in the amount of squeezing that is applied to the PS trace is large, meaning that we cannot use a simple shaping filter to reduce the wavelet distortion. Now, to give you an idea of what samples correspond to one another in each of these traces, I've highlighted corresponding samples with a black box. So now we have a choice. We can simply we could try and use a shaping filter to reduce the wavelet distortion, or we can use the warping with wavelets algorithm. Well, first, let's see what happens when we use the shaping filter. So what I'm going to show you next is the RMS of the residuals for shaping filters of different lengths. And these lengths range from 81 coefficients to 85 coefficients. And you'll notice that we hardly get a decrease in the RMS of the residuals. But now let's use the warping with wavelets algorithm in this case. And I'll highlight these corresponding residuals in red. And you notice that compared to the shaping filter, that with each addition of a coefficient to the inverse PS wavelet B, we can significantly drop the RMS of the residuals compared to adding a coefficient to the shaping filter. So now let's take a closer look at the case where the inverse PS wavelet has 5 coefficients. And let's look at the RMS of the residuals with iterations. And for reference, I'm going to overlay the green and blue boxes that correspond to different alphas. And you'll notice that we reach our first convergent threshold until much later in the iterative process. After 180 iterations or so, we get estimates of the PP wavelet C and the inverse PS wavelet B. But we're going to compare the known PP wavelet and the known PS wavelet to these estimated wavelets. Here's the known PP wavelet, and you'll notice that it is pretty much the same as the estimated PP wavelet. And we see this similar case with the PS wavelet. Here's the known PS wavelet, and here is the estimated wavelet. So now let's use these wavelets in the warping with wavelets algorithm and compare our warped PS trace using warping with wavelets to our PP trace. So for reference, I've plotted the PP trace in black, and on top of it in red, I'm going to plot the warped PS trace that we get using the warping with wavelets and our estimated wavelets. And you'll notice that it lies right on top of the black trace. Now let's compare this to the warped PS trace that we get with the shaping filter. Again, for reference, I've plotted the PP trace in black, and on top of it, I'm going to plot the warped PS trace that we get with the shaping filter in red. And you'll notice that the warped trace that we get with the shaping filter is not the same as the PP trace, as in the case where we use warping with wavelets. So now let's use this Gauss-Newton method and this warping with wavelets algorithm to squeeze a PS image to a PP image. But first we're going to need PP and PS images, which were provided courtesy of Sinopec. Now during our testing, we found that noise decreases the algorithm's ability to drive down the RMS of the residuals and to estimate the correct wavelet. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take this noisy PS image, G, and we're going to apply a recursive exponential filter horizontally to reduce this noise, yielding the following image. And now we can estimate our PP and PS wavelets. But let's not simply use the Gauss-Newton method. Let's compare it to the cyclic search method. So first, I'm going to plot the RMS of the residuals with iterations for the cyclic search method. And next, I'll plot the RMS of the residuals with iteration for the Gauss-Newton method. And you'll notice that the cyclic search method is able to drive down the residuals a bit further than the Gauss-Newton method, as shown. And now let's compare the estimated PP and PS wavelets between these two methods. Now one thing I forgot to mention is that each method starts with a guess of the PP and PS wavelets. And our initial guess for the PP wavelet is simply the shaping filter that shapes the squeezed PS image to the PP image. And our initial PS wavelet is simply an impulse. Now let's look at the wavelets we get with the cyclic search method. And you'll notice that these wavelets with the cyclic search method are quite a bit different from the wavelets we get with the Gauss-Newton method. So now let's use these Gauss-Newton method wavelets to perform the warping wavelets algorithm. Again, we start with our noise-reduced PS image G, and we convolve it with our inverse PS wavelet B. Our next step is to squeeze this deconvolved image to PP time, and then convolve it with a PP wavelet C. And now let's compare our final images we get with the Gauss-Newton method, the cyclic search method, and the shaping filter, the method we used with the shaping filter. And you'll notice that at this scale, you'll notice more similarities between these images than differences. So here's the Gauss-Newton method. And here is the cyclic search method, which is quite similar. And then again, here is the shaping filter. And for reference, I've also plotted the PP image. So where are these differences? Well, these differences are going to occur where we have a variation in the amount of squeezing that is applied to the PS image. So to figure out where this occurs, let's look at the VP-VS ratios. And you'll notice that for most of the image, we have about the same VP-VS ratios except for the shallow and bottom portions. But now let's focus on the shallow portion, which I've highlighted with the blue box. And now let's zoom in on this area on our three different methods, meaning the Gauss-Newton method, the cyclic search method, and the shaping filter method. Here's a zoomed in region of the Gauss-Newton image, and you'll notice differences between this image and the cyclic search image. And these differences are simply due to the differences between our estimated PP and PS wavelets. And now the differences between the cyclic search method and the shaping filter method are due to the shaping filter method not being able to account for the different types of wavelet distortions. So warping with wavelets, here I've shown you how warping with wavelets can be used to squeeze a PS image to a PP image, but it can be applied to any geophysical transformation that involves squeezing or stretching. But to estimate our PP and PS wavelets, we need a variation in the amount of squeezing or stretching applied. Now what makes the warping with wavelets algorithm different from other algorithms is that we're applying a filter before squeezing And we're applying the squeezing operator to time-delayed versions of our PS tracer image. And it's these differences that allow us to reduce our wavelet distortion and to estimate our wavelets. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.